When I found out my son had celebrated his birthday without me, it wasn't the silence that hurt first, it was the laughter I could hear in the background of someone else's photograph. I was standing at my kitchen counter when it happened, the kettle screaming the way it always did when I forgot about it. My phone buzzed once, then again. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and glanced down, expecting a grocery reminder or a weather alert. Instead, I saw my sister's name, and beneath it, a photo preview. There he was, my son, smiling in that familiar, boyish way he'd had since he was 5 years old and missing his 2 front teeth. Only now he was 34, standing in the center of a room I didn't recognize, holding a glass of champagne. Gold balloons floated behind him. A long table overflowed with food, roast meats, candles, flowers, and beside him stood his wife, radiant, one hand resting possessively on his arm. The caption read, "Such a beautiful birthday celebration, you outdid yourself, dear." I stared at the image longer than I should have. My tea went cold. The kettle clicked off on its own. No one had told me about a party. I told myself there must be an explanation. There always is, if you look hard enough. Maybe it was a surprise thrown together last minute. Maybe it was something small that grew bigger than planned. Maybe my invitation was still on its way, lost in the mail or forgotten in a draft message. But the truth settled in my chest before my mind could catch up. I hadn't been invited. That night I lay awake listening to the old house breathe around me. The radiator knocked in short, tired bursts. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then went quiet. I replayed the photo in my head, zooming in on details, the place settings, the string lights, the way my son leaned slightly away from his wife as if unsure where to place himself. I wondered how long this had been planned, days, weeks, and how long I'd been erased. Before all this, my life had been simple in the way most quiet lives are, predictable, comfortable. I woke early, made my coffee strong and bitter, and sat by the window that overlooked my small front garden. I liked watching the morning light creep across the floor, catching dust motes in the air. It reminded me that even stillness has movement if you pay attention. I'd raised my son alone after his father passed. That kind of loss changes the shape of a family forever. It makes you closer in some ways, more cautious in others. My son and I learned each other's rhythms early, when to speak, when to let silence do the work. We were never overly affectionate, but we were steady, dependable. When he married her, I told myself things would change but not disappear. At first, she seemed fine, polite if a little distant. She had a way of smiling without using her eyes, of speaking warmly while keeping her body turned slightly away. I chalked it up to nerves or different upbringings. Not everyone grows up understanding the language of small-town kitchens and unspoken expectations. I tried, I really did. I invited them over for Sunday dinners. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the same recipes my son grew up with. She always complimented the food, pushing it around her plate more than eating it. She'd check her phone between bites, laughing softly at messages I wasn't meant to hear. My son noticed, I think. Sometimes his eyes would flick to mine across the table, apologetic. Sometimes he'd squeeze her hand as if to anchor her in the room, but slowly the visits became less frequent. Sunday dinners turned into maybe next week. Phone calls went unanswered longer than usual. When I asked my son how things were going, he'd say, "Busy, Mom." You know how it is? I told myself that was normal. People grow up. They build lives that don't always have room for the old ones. Still, I felt it, something thinning, stretching like fabric worn too often. The birthday was supposed to be my one certainty. Every year, no matter what else changed, I baked the same chocolate cake with the slightly burnt edges he loved. I'd already bought the ingredients. The cocoa powder sat unopened in my pantry. I'd even picked out a card weeks in advance, one with a simple message because I knew he preferred sincerity over poetry. I hadn't called him on the day itself. I wanted to surprise him later, show up with the cake just like I always had. Instead, I found out through a photograph. The next morning I called him. My fingers hovered over the screen before I pressed his name. I practiced my tone, light, casual. I didn't want to sound accusatory. I didn't want to make him defensive. He answered on the third ring. "Hi, Mom." There was noise behind him, dishes clinking, a muffled laugh, her laugh. "Happy birthday," I said, forcing a smile into my voice. "Oh, thank you," he replied, a pause slipping in where warmth used to be. "Sorry I didn't call, yesterday got busy." I said softly, another pause. "Longer this time?" "You did?" "Yes, your party looked lovely." The line went quiet. I could almost hear him choosing his words, stacking them carefully so they wouldn't topple into something uncomfortable. It was just something small, he said finally, nothing big. I looked around my kitchen, the empty counter, the untouched cake ingredients, the card still sealed on the table. It looked big enough, I said, not unkindly, just honest. He exhaled. Mom, I should go, we'll talk later, okay? Later, that word echoed long after the call ended. I sat there for a long time, my phone resting face down on the table. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires crunching over gravel. Life went on as it always does, even when something inside you has quietly cracked. I didn't know it then, but that birthday wasn't just a party I'd missed. It was the first clear sign of a story being told about me, one I'd never been allowed to hear. I spent the rest of that day doing things that didn't matter because the things that did felt too heavy to touch. I wiped down already clean counters. I folded laundry that could have waited another day. I watered plants that didn't need it. Every small task felt like a way to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander back to that photograph, my son's smile, the gold balloons, the empty space where I should have been. By evening, the quiet in the house felt louder than usual. I reheated soup I didn't finish and sat at the table with the light above me turned low. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room. The clock ticked, steady and indifferent. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. One missed invitation didn't erase a lifetime of motherhood. One party didn't mean I no longer mattered. But doubt has a way of slipping in through the smallest cracks. That night I dreamed of birthdays past. My son at 6, his face smeared with chocolate frosting, laughing so hard he snorted. At 13, pretending he didn't care but keeping the card I wrote tucked into his dresser drawer. At 25, stopping by after work, tired but grateful, hugging me a little longer than usual before leaving. When I woke, the ache in my chest felt old, like something that had been waiting for permission to surface. Over the next few days, I noticed things I might have ignored before. My calls went to voicemail more often. When my son did answer, his voice carried a careful distance, like someone speaking through a partially closed door. He said all the right things. I've been busy, work has been hectic. We'll visit soon, but none of them landed the way they used to. I considered calling his wife directly. I even picked up my phone once, thumb hovering over her name, but something stopped me. A feeling I couldn't quite name, pride maybe, or fear of hearing confirmation of what I wasn't ready to accept. Instead, I waited. A week after the party, my sister came by unannounced. She does that sometimes, shows up with groceries I didn't ask for and news I didn't know I needed. She set the bags down on the counter and looked at me the way sisters do when they sense something beneath the surface. You okay? She asked. I nodded too quickly. Of course. She didn't argue, she never does. She just poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, wrapping her hands around the mug. I saw the pictures, she said gently. I felt my shoulders tense. Everyone did, apparently, she sighed. I thought maybe you were there and just stepped out of frame. No, I said. The word came out flat. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Did they say why? I shook my head. Not really. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the window. Finally, she spoke again. You know, she said carefully, I've heard things. What kind of things? She hesitated, weighing her words. From mutual friends, from people who have talked to her. My stomach tightened. Talked to her about what? She looked at me, eyes filled with a mix of concern and reluctance. About you. The room seemed to tilt slightly. About me how? She's been saying you prefer to be alone, my sister continued. That you get overwhelmed at gatherings. That it's better not to pressure you. I let out a short, humorless laugh. That's news to me. I thought so, she said quickly. That's why I wanted to ask you directly. I thought back to all the times I'd invited them over. All the times I'd suggested dinners, holidays, simple afternoons together. I'd never once said no because I felt overwhelmed. I'd never asked to be left out. She told your son that too? I asked. My sister's silence was answer enough. After she left, I sat alone again, replaying her words. You prefer to be alone. It sounded harmless on the surface, even considerate. But beneath it was something sharper, a narrative being shaped without my consent. And worse, my son believed it. A few days later, I ran into one of my son's coworkers at the grocery store. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about the weather. Then she smiled politely and said, I hope you're doing well. Your son mentioned you've been needing more quiet time lately. There it was again. I forced a smile and nodded, the way people do when correcting someone feels like too much effort. But inside, something hardened. That evening, I decided I needed answers, not assumptions, not secondhand whispers. I called my son and asked if we could meet, just the two of us. He sounded hesitant, but agreed. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and handwritten menus. I arrived early, chose a table by the window, and folded my hands together to keep them from shaking. When he walked in, I almost cried. He looked tired, older than I remembered. His shoulders slumped slightly like he was carrying something heavy. "Hi, Mom," he said, leaning down to hug me. I held onto him a second longer than usual. He stiffened just a bit. We ordered coffee. Talked about neutral things at first, work, the weather, a movie he'd seen recently. Then I took a breath. "I need to ask you something," I said. He nodded, eyes cautious. "Why didn't you invite me to your birthday?" He looked down at his cup. "I thought you wouldn't want to come." My heart sank. "Why would you think that?" He hesitated. "She said you've been feeling overwhelmed lately, that crowds are hard for you." I leaned back in my chair, stunned. "Did I ever say that to you?" "No," he admitted, "but she seemed sure." "And you didn't ask me?" He winced. "I didn't want to push you." There it was, the quiet manipulation dressed up as concern. "I've never been overwhelmed by celebrating you," I said softly. "Never." He looked up then, confusion flickering across his face. "She said you prefer your routines, that surprises make you anxious." I thought of all the surprises I'd embraced for his sake over the years. New schools, new cities, new phases of his life I navigated with love and patience. "I wish you talked to me," I said. "So do I," he replied, and for the first time I heard genuine regret in his voice. But regret, I was learning, doesn't undo damage already done. As we sat there, I realized this wasn't just about a party. It was about a story being told in my absence, a version of me that was easier to exclude, easier to silence. And I didn't yet know why. After that meeting at the cafe, I went home with more questions than answers. The sky was already dark when I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flickering the way it always did when the bulb was about to go. I didn't bother fixing it. The dimness felt appropriate. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood, comforting, familiar. I set my purse down and stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. My son's words replayed in my head. She seemed sure. That was what unsettled me most. Not just that she'd spoken for me, but that she'd spoken with confidence. As if she'd rehearsed the role, as if she'd been laying this groundwork for a while. Over the next week, I paid closer attention to the small details I might have dismissed before. When I texted my son, his replies came slower than usual, shorter. Sometimes he'd respond hours later with a polite, "Sorry, busy day," even when I knew he had a lunch break around noon. When I suggested coming by to drop off something I'd picked up for him, a book he liked, a spare kitchen tool, he'd say, "It's okay, Mom, you don't have to. You don't have to." Those words stung more than outright rejection. They implied burden where there had once been ease. I wondered how many other small choices had been made for me, how many times she'd framed my absence as preference rather than exclusion. It was clever in its simplicity. If I wasn't there, it wasn't because I wasn't wanted, it was because I'd chosen not to be. And if my son believed that, then no one was at fault. One afternoon, my neighbor, Mrs. Larkin, stopped me while I was checking the mail. "Your son and his wife hosted a lovely dinner last weekend," she said. "Everyone was talking about it." I forced a smile. "I'm glad to hear that." She tilted her head. "I assumed you were resting. She mentioned you've been taking more time to yourself lately." There it was again, the same phrase passed from mouth to mouth like a harmless truth. "Yes," I said slowly, "I've been quiet." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. That night, I sat at my desk and opened an old photo album. Not because I wanted to dwell in the past, but because I needed to remind myself who I was before someone else decided for me. There I was, years ago, hosting block parties, organizing school events, welcoming strangers into my home with extra plates and mismatched chairs. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't withdrawn. I'd never been someone who needed protecting from life. So why paint me that way now? A few days later, my son called unexpectedly. "Hey, Mom," he said. "We're thinking of having a small get-together this weekend, just a few people." My heart lifted despite myself. "That sounds nice." He hesitated. "Would that be okay for you?" I closed my eyes. There it was, the question shaped by someone else's voice. Yes, I said firmly, it would be more than okay. Another pause. All right, I'll let her know. I'll let her know. The words settled heavily in my chest. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being the person he checked with first. When the weekend came, I waited. Saturday passed, then Sunday, no invitation came, no address, no time. By Monday, I understood. He de-asked her. She'd decided. I didn't confront him right away. I needed more than suspicion. I needed clarity, so I did something I'd never done before. I reached out to her. I sent a simple message. Hi dear, I heard there might be a small gathering this weekend. I'd love to come if that's okay. The reply came an hour later. Oh. I didn't want to overwhelm you. I thought you preferred quiet time these days. Let's plan something just us soon. The words were polite, smiling, considerate on the surface. But beneath them was control. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. A dozen responses formed and dissolved. Finally I typed, I've never said that, I would have loved to be there. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then I must have misunderstood, I'll keep that in mind. No apology, no explanation, just a smooth sidestep. That night I couldn't sleep. The house creaked as it always did when the temperature dropped. I lay there listening to the tick of the clock, thinking about how easily someone could rewrite you if you weren't paying attention. I began to wonder if this started long before the birthday, before the dinners dwindled. Before the phone calls shortened, I thought back to holidays she'd simplified. Events she'd handled so I didn't have to worry, moments where my presence had been quietly deemed unnecessary. It all formed a pattern I hadn't wanted to see. The next morning, I called my son again. This time, I didn't soften my tone. I messaged her, I said after we exchanged greetings. He went quiet. Okay, she said she didn't invite me because she thought I preferred quiet time. That's what she told me, he said, defensive now. I told her that wasn't true, I continued, and she didn't deny saying it. Another pause longer. Mom, he said carefully, she's just trying to keep things smooth. For whom? I asked, he sighed. Everyone, except me, he didn't answer. That silence told me more than words ever could. I realized then that this wasn't just about being left out, it was about being reshaped into someone easier to manage. Someone whose absence could be explained away. Someone whose voice could be replaced. And if I didn't speak up soon, that version of me would become the only one anyone remembered. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, quiet, almost polite pieces that fit together only when I finally stopped looking away. A few days after my last conversation with my son, I received a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Linda. She used to be my son's high school teacher, the kind who remembered birthdays and favorite books long after students graduated. We stayed in touch loosely over the years, exchanging holiday cards and the occasional update. I hope I'm not calling it a bad time, she said. No, I replied, surprised but pleased. It's good to hear your voice. We chatted for a few minutes about small things. Then she cleared her throat. I ran into your daughter-in-law at a fundraiser last week, she said. She mentioned something that's been bothering me. My chest tightened. What did she say? Linda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She told a group of us that you've been difficult. That you don't approve of their marriage and that it's been emotionally draining for your son. The room seemed to tilt again like it had at the cafe weeks earlier. That's not true, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think so, Linda replied quickly. But she said it with such conviction. She mentioned how she's been protecting him from unnecessary stress. Protecting him. The lie clicked into place with a sharp, painful clarity. It wasn't just that she'd been excluding me, she'd been actively rewriting my role in my son's life. Turning me from a supportive mother into a source of tension, a problem she needed to manage. I thanked Linda and hung up, my hands shaking as I set the phone down. I walked to the window and stared out at the street. Children rode bicycles past my house, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. A woman walked her dog, phone pressed to her ear. Ordinary life unfolding as usual. Inside me, something cracked open. All those times my son seemed distant. All those moments he'd hesitated before answering my calls. He hadn't been pulling away on his own. He'd been guided, carefully, consistently, under the guise of care. I sank into the chair by the window and closed my eyes. I remembered the first time she'd cried in front of him, how he'd rushed to comfort her, shooting me a look that said, "Please don't make this harder." I remembered conversations that ended abruptly when she entered the room. The way she framed disagreements as misunderstandings caused by my traditional views. I'd been too willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. That evening, my son came over unannounced. I heard his car pull up and felt a strange mix of relief and dread. When he knocked, I opened the door and stepped aside without a word. He looked around as if the house itself might accuse him. "You okay?" I gestured for him to sit. "We need to talk." He sat at the kitchen table, the same one he'd done homework at as a child. I poured 2 cups of coffee, hands steady now in a way they hadn't been earlier. "Linda called me today," I said. He stiffened. "Why?" "She told me what your wife has been saying about me." His jaw tightened. "She didn't mean it like that." "What did she mean then?" I asked calmly. "That you and I clash sometimes," he said, "that it's stressful for both of us." I took a breath. "Have I ever told you I don't approve of your marriage?" "No," he admitted. "Have I ever tried to interfere?" "No." "Then why would she tell people that I'm difficult?" He looked away. "She feels judged." "By what?" I asked. "My silence." He rubbed his temples. "She says you're cold to her." I thought back to every polite smile, every invitation extended, every effort made. Being reserved isn't the same as being cruel. He didn't argue. I leaned forward. "She told people I prefer to be alone, that I get overwhelmed, that I don't want to be included." He swallowed. "She thought she was helping?" "No," I said gently but firmly. "She was controlling the narrative." The word hung between us. He looked up then, something like doubt flickering across his face. "Why would she do that?" That was the question, wasn't it? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into a drawer and pulled out something I'd kept without knowing why, a stack of printed messages my son had sent me over the past year. Invitations canceled. Plans changed. Apologies that felt rehearsed. "Read these," I said, sliding them across the table. He scanned them slowly. His expression shifted, confusion giving way to realization. "She told me you said no," he murmured. "I didn't." Silence stretched between us, heavy and fragile. "She said you didn't feel comfortable around her friends," he continued quietly, "that you felt judged." I shook my head. "I've never even met most of them." He pushed his chair back slightly, standing halfway before sitting again. "I need to talk to her." "Yes," I said. "You do." That night after he left, I felt both lighter and unbearably tired. Truth has a way of doing that. It lifts one weight while revealing another beneath it. The next day, my son called me from work. "We talked," he said, "and she admitted she may have exaggerated," he said slowly. "She said she was trying to create boundaries by lying. She says she felt threatened." I closed my eyes. "By me?" He didn't answer right away. "She says you and I are very close." A sad smile tugged at my lips. "I'm his mother." "I know," he said. "I told her that." "What else did she say?" He exhaled. "That she was afraid of losing control." There it was, the heart of it, not concern, not protection, control. I sat down heavily. "And how do you feel about that?" "I don't know," he admitted, confused, angry, guilty. "For what?" "For believing her." I reached for the phone as if he were there. "You trusted your wife, that's not a crime." But inside, I knew things would never be simple again, because once a lie is uncovered, it doesn't disappear quietly. It demands consequences, choices. And the next one would not be mine alone. The days that followed felt like standing in the aftermath of a storm, everything familiar yet subtly rearranged. My son didn't come by for a while after that conversation. He called, yes, checked in, asked how I was sleeping, whether I'd eaten. The way he used to when he was younger and sensed something was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. I could hear it in his voice, the tug-of-war happening inside him. Loyalty pulling one way, truth pulling another. I didn't push. I knew better than that. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I returned to routines that had steadied me for years. Morning walks through the neighborhood even when the air bit at my cheeks. Cooking meals that required patience, stirring, simmering, waiting. I found comfort in the predictability of it all. But beneath that calm, I was preparing myself. Because clarity, once reached, asks something of you. About a week later, my son called and asked if he could come over again. This time he brought her. I opened the door and found them standing side by side. He looked tense, she looked composed, too composed. Her smile was practiced, the kind that didn't reach the eyes. "Thank you for seeing us," she said. I stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. Of course. We sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. I offered tea, she declined politely. My son accepted. When we were settled, she spoke first. "I understand there's been some misunderstanding," she said, folding her hands in her lap. A misunderstanding usually involves two perspectives, I replied evenly. This involves facts. Her smile tightened. I never intended to hurt you. Intent doesn't erase impact, I said. My son shifted in his seat. She sighed as if burdened. I felt like I had to manage expectations. You and your son are very close. Sometimes it felt intrusive. I kept my voice calm. Did I ever overstep? She hesitated. It wasn't about specific actions, it was about presence. I nodded slowly. So you removed me, she bristled. I didn't remove you, you spoke for me, I interrupted gently. You told people what I felt without asking me. You told my son I didn't want to be included. She glanced at him, then back at me. I thought it would be easier that way. For whom? I asked again. She looked down. For us. The room went quiet. My son leaned forward. Why didn't you tell me you felt threatened? She swallowed. I didn't want to seem insecure. And lying was better, he asked. She flinched. I watched them, this couple I'd tried so hard to accept, realizing that this moment would shape everything that came after. I never asked to compete, I said softly. There is no contest between a mother and a wife unless someone creates one. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a brief moment I saw fear behind her composure. I was afraid you'd always come first, she said quietly. I took a breath. Love isn't a ranking system. My son's eyes filled with something like relief or grief. The conversation didn't end with apologies and hugs, it ended with boundaries. I need honesty, my son said. From both of you, I nodded. I can do that. She nodded too, though her agreement felt more reluctant. Before they left, she turned to me. I hope we can move forward. I studied her face. That depends on actions, not hopes. After the door closed behind them, I sank into the couch, exhaustion washing over me. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused or insulted. But speaking truth still costs something. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from my son. Thank you for today. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner, I replied simply. I'm glad you see it now. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects became visible. People who'd kept their distance began reaching out again. Invitations appeared, casual, hesitant, as if testing whether I'd accept. I did. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. At one gathering, a friend pulled me aside. I'm glad you came. I always thought it was strange you never showed up. So did I said with a small smile. Word travels fast in small communities. Truth even faster once it's a loud room. I didn't relish the shift. I didn't need vindication. What I needed was balance restored. My son began visiting on his own again. Sometimes we talked about light things, sometimes about nothing at all. Once he brought over a photo album and asked me to tell him stories he'd forgotten. But there was still tension. Healing isn't linear, and trust once bent takes time to straighten. One afternoon he said, she's been quieter lately. I nodded. Change can do that. She's struggling, he added. I don't doubt it, I said, but struggling doesn't excuse harm. He sighed. I know. The real consequence came not in anger but in visibility. She could no longer hide behind concern or politeness. Her words had been weighed, found wanting. At a family gathering a month later, she hovered on the edges, unsure of her footing. I didn't gloat. I did confront. I simply existed, present, calm, unashamed. When my son toasted that night, he raised his glass and said, to family, to honesty. Our eyes met across the room. I understood then that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about reclaiming my voice. And once reclaimed, it would not be easily taken again. After that family gathering, something subtle but important shifted. People began treating me the way they always had, without hesitation, without that careful tone reserved for someone fragile. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It showed up in small ways. A neighbor asking my opinion on a recipe. A cousin inviting me to sit beside her instead of at the edge of the table. Conversations that no longer paused when I entered a room. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that until it returned. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, seemed to shrink into herself. Not in a way that inspired pity, but in a way that suggested uncertainty. She no longer spoke for my son in conversations. When plans were made, she looked to him instead of deciding outright, and he noticed. One afternoon, he came by alone, carrying a bag of apples from a roadside stand. He set them on the counter and leaned against it, watching me wash dishes. She doesn't do well when she's not in control, he said quietly. I dried my hands and turned to him. Very few people do. She says she feels exposed, he continued. Like people are watching her more closely now. That's what happens when trust is broken, I replied. Attention follows. He nodded, thoughtful. I keep replaying things in my head, moments I brushed off. Times I assumed you were distant when you were actually being pushed aside. I touched his arm. We all believe the stories that feel safest at the time. He looked at me then, eyes wet. I'm sorry, Mom. I hugged him, feeling the familiar weight of his body against mine. I know. That hug felt like a stitch pulling something torn back into place. A few weeks later, my daughter-in-law asked to meet me alone. The request surprised me. I considered declining. Not out of fear, but out of caution. Still, something told me this moment mattered. We met at a quiet cafe near her office. Neutral ground. She arrived early this time, hands clasped tightly around her cup. Thank you for coming, she said. I nodded. You wanted to talk. She took a breath. I owe you an apology. I waited. I told myself I was protecting my marriage, she continued. But really, I was protecting my insecurities. I studied her face. She looked tired, older somehow, less polished. I grew up watching my mother be sidelined by her in-laws, she said. I promised myself I'd never feel that small. And so you made me smaller instead, I said gently. She flinched. I didn't realize how far it had gone. I thought of the birthday. The whispered narratives, the isolation. It went far enough. She nodded. I know. Silence stretched between us, not hostile but heavy. I can't undo what I did, she said, but I want to do better. I considered her words carefully. Doing better starts with honesty. And with letting my son have relationships that don't threaten yours. She swallowed. I'm trying. Trying is a beginning, I said. Consistency is what matters. She nodded again, eyes glistening. I don't expect forgiveness right away. Forgiveness isn't a schedule, I replied. It's a process. When we parted, there were no hugs, just a mutual understanding that something had been named. Life didn't return to what it had been. It became something new. Holidays were different, carefully navigated, occasionally awkward, but honest. Invitations came directly to me now, not filtered through assumptions. If I couldn't attend, it was because I said no, not because someone decided for me. My son grew more confident in asserting his own voice. I watched him learn to balance love and boundaries, something I'd had to do long before he was born. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, he said, I didn't realize how easy it is to lose someone without meaning to. I stirred the pot slowly. It happens when silence fills the space where truth should be. He nodded. I won't let that happen again. The public consequence wasn't dramatic humiliation or loud confrontation. It was something quieter and more lasting. People adjusted their perception of her. Trust, once questioned, doesn't return to its original shape. It becomes conditional, careful. She felt it, I think, the subtle distance, the way conversations no longer flowed as easily. And I felt something else, peace, not because she'd suffered, but because I'd spoken. I no longer wondered what people thought of me. I no longer waited for permission to belong. One afternoon, as I baked a cake, chocolate edges just slightly burnt, I realized something that made me smile. I wasn't baking it for a birthday, I was baking it because I wanted to. That freedom tasted sweeter than any celebration. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought about that first photo, the gold balloons, the laughter I hadn't been part of. But the pain attached to it had softened, dulled by understanding. That party had revealed a lie, yes, but it had also revealed my strength. And that, I realized, was something no one could take from me again. With time, the sharp edges of everything began to round. Not disappear, just soften enough that I could hold the memories without cutting myself on them. I noticed it first in the way my mornings felt lighter. I still woke early, still brewed my coffee strong, still sat by the window watching the neighborhood stretch awake. But the heaviness that used to sit on my chest like an extra weight was gone. I breathed more easily. I laughed more freely, even when no one else was around to hear it. Peace doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, like warmth returning to a room that's been cold for too long. My relationship with my son found a new rhythm. Not the old one, we'd outgrown that, but something steadier, more honest. He called without hesitation now, sometimes just to ask what I was cooking. Sometimes to tell me about something small that happened at work. Those calls mattered more than the big conversations ever had. One evening, he stopped by with a small, wrapped box. I know it's late, he said, standing awkwardly in my doorway, but I wanted you to have this. Inside was a framed photograph, not from the birthday party, from years earlier. The two of us sitting on the front steps of this very house, ice cream melting in our hands, both of us squinting into the sun. I found it while cleaning, he said. I realized I don't want memories like this to become casualties of misunderstandings. My throat tightened. Thank you. He stayed for dinner that night. We ate quietly, comfortably, no tension, no explanations needed. My daughter-in-law kept her distance for a while after our cafe conversation. Not out of avoidance, I think, but caution. When she did reach out, it was tentative, direct, honest. Would you like to come over for dinner? She asked one afternoon, just us. I paused before answering, then yes, I would. The dinner was simple, pasta, salad. Bread still warm from the oven. She didn't overcompensate, didn't pretend nothing had happened. That restraint spoke volumes. At one point she said, I used to think strength meant holding everything together myself. I looked at her across the table. Strength is knowing when to let go. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. We weren't friends after that night, but we weren't adversaries either. We were two women learning, belatedly, how to share space without fear. As months passed, the story that had once painted me as distant dissolved entirely. People saw me again at gatherings, at church, at the market, not as a problem to tiptoe around, but as a person who belonged. One afternoon, I overheard someone say, she's always been so steady. I smiled to myself. Steady doesn't mean silent, it means grounded. The real healing, though, came from within. I realized how close I'd come to shrinking myself to fit a version of me someone else found convenient. How easily I'd almost accepted invisibility because it felt easier than confrontation. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. When I spoke now, I did so clearly, kindly, but without hesitation. When I was invited somewhere, I answered honestly. When I wasn't, I didn't invent excuses on someone else's behalf. One afternoon, as I sorted through old papers, I found the birthday card I'd never given my son. I opened it, reading the words I'd written weeks before that painful discovery. I'm proud of the man you've become. I'm always here. I closed the card and slid it into a new envelope. That evening, I gave it to him. I wrote this before everything, I said. But it's still true. He read it quietly, then pulled me into a hug. I know. I don't pretend the experience didn't change me. It did. It taught me that love can be manipulated when people are afraid. That silence, when misused, can become a weapon. And that dignity isn't loud, it's firm. Most of all, it reminded me that my voice matters even when it shakes. That birthday I missed will always sting a little, but it no longer defines me. Because what came after, the truth, the reckoning, the rebuilding, gave me something more lasting than an invitation. It gave me myself back. Some evenings, when the house is quiet and the light fades just right, I sit and think about how easily this could have gone differently. How I could have stayed quiet, accepted the story being told about me, faded politely into the background. But I didn't. And because I didn't, my son learned something too, about listening, about questioning, about protecting relationships without erasing others. That might be the greatest gift I could ever give him. By the time the next year rolled around, I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed. That might sound like a small thing, but it was. For months, every notification had carried the weight of expectation: good news, bad news, exclusion, reconciliation. Now it was just a sound again, neutral, ordinary. Life had settled into something steady. My son and I had found our footing. Not the seamless closeness of his childhood, but a mature connection shaped by honesty. He asked my opinion again, about work decisions, about a home repair, about nothing at all. Sometimes we sat in silence, comfortable enough to let the quiet speak, and I noticed something else. He laughed more easily. One afternoon, as we walked through a park near his house, he said, I didn't realize how much tension I was carrying until it lifted. I nodded. When you're in the middle of something, it feels normal. He kicked at the gravel path. I thought choosing peace meant choosing sides. And now, I asked, now I know it means choosing truth. That sentence stayed with me. My daughter-in-law continued her slow, careful efforts. She stopped framing herself as the gatekeeper of my son's time. When plans were made, she included me in the conversation instead of deciding outcomes ahead of time. There were still moments of awkwardness, polite pauses, slight hesitations. Trust doesn't bounce back, it rebuilds brick by brick, but I could see her changing too. At a family gathering, she stood beside me while someone else spoke over us. She waited, let me finish my sentence. That small courtesy felt like a quiet apology. Later, she said, I'm learning to sit with discomfort instead of trying to control it. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something important. She wasn't evil, she was afraid. Fear doesn't excuse harm, but understanding it can soften anger. As spring arrived, my house filled with light again. I opened windows. Let fresh air move through rooms that had felt stale for too long. I rearranged furniture not because it was necessary, but because I wanted change to be visible. One morning, as I cleaned out a drawer, I found old birthday decorations, streamers, candles, napkins from years past. I laughed softly, shaking my head at myself. I almost threw them away, almost. Instead, I placed them neatly in a box and labeled it memories. Not loss, not regret, just memories, because that's what they were now. Then unexpectedly another birthday approached, my son's. I didn't mention it. Didn't ask about plans. I told myself that whatever happened, I would be okay. A few days before the date, my phone rang. "Mom," he said, his voice bright. "Can you come over Saturday evening?" "What's the occasion?" I asked lightly. He chuckled. "You'll see." When I arrived, the house was full, but not crowded, just family, a few close friends, no extravagance, no spectacle. And there on the dining table sat a chocolate cake, edges slightly burnt. My throat tightened. "I remembered," he said quietly, coming to stand beside me. "I wanted it to feel like us." I reached for his hand. "That's more than enough." She stood across the room, watching us, not possessive, not defensive, just present. Later, when candles were lit and wishes made, my son cleared his throat. "I want to say something," he said. The room stilled. "This past year taught me how easily people can be misunderstood when we stop talking to each other," he continued, "and how important it is to listen to everyone we love." He looked at me, then at his wife. "I'm grateful for second chances. I didn't cry, I didn't need to, I felt whole." That night after everyone left, I lingered by the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for inviting me," I replied. It wasn't forgiveness spoken out loud, it was something quieter. Mutual respect. As I drove home, streetlights passed rhythmically overhead. I thought about how far we'd come, not back to where we were, but forward into something more honest. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment before going inside. The porch light glowed steadily now. I'd fixed it months ago. I realized then that this story, my story, was never really about a birthday party. It was about what happens when someone decides you're easier to manage when you're absent, when love is mistaken for competition, when silence is used as a shortcut. And it was about what happens when you gently but firmly step back into the room. I don't share this to paint myself as a hero. I made mistakes too. I waited too long to speak. I assumed good intentions where clarity was needed. But I learned that dignity doesn't require permission, that being calm doesn't mean being invisible, and that the people who truly love you will adjust when the truth is placed in front of them. Sometimes painfully, sometimes slowly, but they will adjust. As I turned off the engine and stepped into the cool night air, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not bitterness, peace. The kind that comes from knowing you didn't abandon yourself to keep others comfortable. And that, I believe, is a lesson worth carrying forward. By the time the house went quiet that night, I understood something I hadn't known how to name before. Closure doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, like realizing you're no longer bracing yourself when the phone rings. I washed the dishes from the birthday dinner slowly, letting the warm water run over my hands. The kitchen smelled faintly of chocolate and vanilla. Outside, the night had settled into its usual stillness, the kind that no longer felt lonely to me. I dried the last plate and placed it in the cabinet, then stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Not because I was sad, but because I was grateful. Grateful that I had spoken when it would have been easier to stay silent. Grateful that my son had listened when the truth finally reached him. Grateful that I had not allowed myself to disappear just to keep the peace. There was a time, after that birthday party, after that photograph, when I thought the loss was permanent. When I believed I had already been replaced, rewritten, quietly dismissed. But what I learned is this: you can be pushed out of a room, you can be talked over, you can be misunderstood, but you cannot truly be erased unless you erase yourself, and I refuse to do that. My relationship with my daughter-in-law is not perfect now, it may never be, but it is honest. And honesty, I've learned, is far more valuable than forced closeness. We coexist with boundaries, with respect. With an understanding that fear does not give anyone the right to control another person's place in a family. She learned that love doesn't grow by shrinking someone else. And I learned that kindness does not mean silence. As for my son, he grew that year. In ways that were painful for him, necessary, human. He learned that being a good husband doesn't require being a blind son, and being a good son doesn't require choosing sides, it requires choosing truth. Sometimes growth looks like disappointment first. If I could speak to the woman I was standing in that kitchen on the day I saw that photo, the woman holding her phone with shaking hands, I would tell her this: you are not too much, you are not outdated, you are not a burden for wanting to belong. And you are not wrong for expecting honesty from the people you love. Family should never feel like a room you have to earn entry into by staying quiet. I still bake that chocolate cake sometimes. Not every year, not on a schedule, just when the mood strikes me. And every time I smell those slightly burnt edges, I smile, not because of what I lost, but because of what I reclaimed. My voice, my place, my dignity. If you're listening to this and you've ever been quietly excluded, if someone has spoken for you instead of listening to you, if you've been made to feel difficult simply for existing, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need to shout to be heard, but you do need to speak. Because the people who truly love you will adjust when they see you standing in your truth, and the ones who don't were never meant to decide your worth in the first place. So tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have stayed quiet or stepped back into the room? If this story spoke to you, stay with us. There are many voices like mine, quiet, steady, and finally choosing themselves, and none of them deserve to be ignored.